Welcome to our second lecture of the exciting journey into and through Celtic theology. This discussion is really going to be a kind of starting place. We're getting into some more of the depth of Celtic theology, but also really where we can say Celtic theology got its initial start as a Christian theology. It was there before, but it really took off with the work of Patrick of Ireland, my namesake. And we're also going to talk about the priorities of Celtic theology. The scene here is from the Rock of Cashel. This is a famous castle in the castle of what used to be the King of Munster in Ireland. And there's this great story of when Patrick, who as a missionary came and evangelized this area, and the King of Munster, Angus at the time, listened and said, I want to become a Christian. And Patrick then took him to be baptized. And as part of the process, Patrick had what was called a crozier, which is a long stick, a walking stick, a sign of his bishop, had a curved in, kind of like a shepherd's stick. And the bottom of it was pointed. And at some point, he accidentally put down his crozier into the foot of the High King Angus. And in this process, Angus didn't say anything. And as the ceremony went on, Patrick looked down and saw that there was blood all around where Angus was standing. And Patrick said, "Why didn't you say anything?" And Angus said, "I just thought this was part of the process." People were very unsure about what Christianity was and what it involved at the time, and it was really a learning process, and yet there was a kind of collegiality, a learning and honoring. And it was said that Patrick was very impressed by the bravery and the ability for the king not to have said anything despite what the massive amount of pain he was in. And it even encouraged him about the idea that the Irish were going to be a very significant Christian population because of their willingness to endure pain and hardship and struggle for a better end. On the side here is what's called the Cross of St. Patrick, and while the original is now stored away in a separate building, this replica here is very ancient, not quite probably as old as Patrick himself, but it was a pretty ancient version of how Ireland tended to make different kinds of art, riffing off the themes and Christian themes that represented certain saints and certain stories and certain narratives. And so I took this picture when I was in Ireland back in around 2002. So this has a lot of memories for me as well. And Patrick of Ireland, as I've said before, was my entryway into Celtic theology. I started studying him in college and reading his writings, and it had such a transformative impact. And I will admit, I think I only got a B+ on that research paper in college. It was one of those really important papers for me personally, but probably could have been better done in a lot of ways. And sometimes this goes to show what can be most transformative in our academic journey isn't always marked with the best marks. But here I am now teaching a class on Celtic theology, and I think my professor back then would feel very excited that he was part of the process. Mark Knoll, a famous Christian historian, was my teacher then. Great teacher. So let's jump into study more of Patrick of Ireland and the priorities of Celtic theology. The picture above is actually the full picture of the Rock of Cashel. As you can see, it's built on a hill there. As Ireland had never been conquered by Rome, it maintained much of its traditional culture and language well into the second millennium. Britain had been occupied by Rome for several hundred years by then, maybe even longer, leading to a long-standing presence of a Christian population there. Some people even say within a generation or two after the crucifixion itself. So their Christian message tended to follow the trade routes of the Roman Empire, and so you could have a Christian presence in what we now call England or southern Britain, and parts of Wales very early, that never really got outside the trade routes for the most part. We can see that the Ireland was never conquered by Rome, and then north of Hadrian's Wall, what is now Scotland, was never conquered for the most part by Rome. There were influences, there were connections, but you didn't have the same kind of colonizing presence that so rapidly can change culture and language. In 429, Pope Celestine sent a commission headed by Germanus of Auxerre to combat the rising Pelagius heresy that appeared to have made strong inroads into British Christianity. And we'll get back to Pelagius later on in this wider Celtic theology discussion. Accompanying him at this time may have been Palladius, who served as a deacon. Ireland, this should be emphasized, was seen as the end of the world. And why is that important? Because of the prophetic word that Jesus will return when the gospel had been preached to the ends of the world. And Ireland was the farthest northwest corner that they knew about. They knew about Asia, and missionaries had gone east from Rome and east from Israel for a long time, but this is the farthest west. So when they reached on one side China and Japan pretty early on, and then now on the other side are reaching Ireland, this actually brings with it a kind of eschatological excitement. So this wasn't a small matter for them to not only say we're going to combat some heresy of the church, but we're also going to push the bounds until we reach the oceans on both sides. So Palladius then, in light of that already being present in the British churches, was sent by the Emperor Theodosius in about 431 to serve as a bishop to believers who were already in Ireland. So it seems that the trade route, and there was trade, that even if they hadn't been conquered, there were boats and traders going back and forth. Beyond this, however, nothing is known of his mission, how he fared, what he'd accomplished. He really didn't have any kind of resonating impact. He probably seemed to have served the already established Christians that may have been there, British Christians, we can say, who were there. So it wasn't a missionary moment. He stayed probably within the bounds of the established communities. He did not make a permanent stamp on the character or expression of Irish Christianity. There was really no resonating Christian influence. His role was maintenance of a theological shaky community, probably because part of his role was to combat a perceived heresy. He didn't come in as a missionary. He came in as someone who was trying to police the boundaries and make sure they didn't go too far out, which is a very different kind of personality, of course. Richu, an early chronicler of the life of Patrick, writes that those wild and vicious people would not easily accept his teaching, and Palladius did not want to spend long in a land not his own. I don't know if that was his accent, but it sounded dramatic. So he decided to return to the Pope and leave his minor mission. He just didn't have that same kind of calling. Having crossed the sea from Ireland to Britain, he died while in Britain, making his way back to Rome. So again, we don't really have any kind of chronicle. We don't have any report. We just don't know. We just know of him, and the fact that it just didn't seem to keep. But now we get to Patrick. All we can reliably know about Patrick comes from his two authentic writings, which we are reading in this course. Of course, his confession and his letter to Coroticus. There were other writings attributed to Patrick, but they're not considered authentic. They may reflect a kind of Patrick tradition, so they may or may not have some influence or reflect some teaching, but the confession and the letter to Coroticus are from his own hand. They are his own thoughts. They are actually as a representation of the man and his mission himself. There were also biographies written, which we're also going to read, but these have the characteristics of what's called a hagiography. A hagiography is a way of writing that makes the subject of the writing into an especially holy, revered, sainted figure, adding clearly legendary elements like the driving on of snakes, turning into a deer, and a lot of other things. Which the goal of these is a lot of the way we use superheroes now. now, these kind of idealized humanity, talking about a kind of moral or ethical or spiritual advance as a kind of as a model for us, and to see this is the amazing miracles that God did. And in a lot of ways, too, reflecting back the early Irish stories of their heroes, like Cuchulainn and some others, who were these magnified warriors and these magnified heroes and did everything grandly, and it come into a kind of mythic, almost godlike in some cases, or entirely godlike in other cases, expression of this idealized humanity. What does it mean for the Irish to see themselves? You can read in these stories. What is the ideal version that they saw of humanity? And then the hagiographies take that similar kind of storytelling, this magnification of someone's impact, of someone's personality, of someone's commitment, of someone's endurance, and put that into a Christian narrative, serving much the same role as an example and a model for those who would have followed. An inspiration in times of struggle, an inspiration in times of finding their own discipline. The trouble for us in our era is we are much more drawn to authenticity because we're turned off by idealization, because we say, well, that's not really accurate to reality, and it doesn't represent what I'm dealing with. We want to know people's faults and struggles, because then it helps us see how even the great people overcome that. You can see the example of Marvel Comics always digging more into the faults and the troubles of their heroes rather than idealizing them like Superman has tended to do in the past. So essentially, the confessio, the Latin version of confession, is a testimony of Patrick's life and ministry. It's not an autobiography. It's not this complete telling of his story. It's an intended document to talk about his life and mission for the purpose of answering some charges that were being levied against him. Details are unknown about what the actual cause was, but it seems he was being charged by the British Church, who were the hierarchy controlling the region of the time, with some kind of sins or misdeeds, probably relating to, as much to some mistake Patrick made or miscommunication, and really political. There's a lot of political battles, even in the early church, about people who feel like their territory has been overcome, or don't like one person or the other, or disagree theologically or strategically with something you've done. And so you lay these charges out, and it happens still. Let's make these charges against people we don't like. And you can hear this constantly against a lot of missional people or people from other denominations. Patrick doesn't dispute the charges. So it seems like it's the key charge against him, among other things, were at the core something related to his younger life, where he did something especially bad. He was called out on it, and now he has to say, you know what, I don't deny that, but look at what God has done. He committed them prior to be taken into slavery. So what were these charges? Like Paul's thorn in the flesh, we don't know. And often it's more an indication of the interpreter. Whenever you hear someone say, this was what Paul's thorn in the flesh, I'm always thinking, well, that's maybe your thorn in the flesh. Likely something fairly serious. A big suggestion that has been carried on was that he participated in idol worship at some point, which for him was a particular sin because, as he says, he grew up in a Christian family. His father and grandfather were priests. They could get married then. And so participating in idol worship wasn't just a innocent kind of paganness. There was an intentional rebellion about it, and a forsaking of Christ even after he had been baptized. And that sitting this way after you've been baptized took on a pretty heavy weight, because they weren't sure how much sin would be forgiven after you were baptized. He confessed his sin to a friend and fellow priest when he was young in the ministry. So he felt guilty about this. He confessed it. He went to someone that he trusted to help him overcome it. Yet, this friend told other people. Read it for yourself. This is just a brief overview. Now is the letter to Coroticus. Above is a picture of me in my Irish raiding days, early on, before seminary. The Irish were not the only raiders. It was mutual. Caroticus was a minor British king, a Christian who raided Western Ireland and took captives for slaves. Patrick writes a very strongly worded condemnation of this, saying it is outside the bounds of Christian behavior to take slaves and to use them and to abuse them, to dehumanize them. Apparently, some of the captives were even newly baptized, adding to the shame. Patrick said they were still wearing their baptismal clothes when Caroticus comes in and takes some of the slaves, and Patrick could not be more fierce against this. It's an early example of how the work of evangelism and mission and empire building opposed each other. It's also another example of how evangelism, mission, and what we might call now social engagement, social justice, were part and parcel. Patrick did not separate these elements. To argue for the benefit of these captured slaves was part of what Patrick saw as his mission as a leader of the church, as a leader in evangelizing these people, and as a prophet against the misbehavior and dehumanizing acts of those in the Christian church who called themselves Christian but were not acting like it. Taking slaves was not seen as a Christian act. In fact, the early church actively redeemed slaves, bought slaves. They actively moved towards the ending of slavery within Christian lands. Obviously, that changed. Sadly, and this is where Patrick's call to us continues onward through the centuries, saying, even though people were justifying this, even though people were excusing this, this is not within the bounds of Christianity, and Patrick stood against it. The evangelism of Ireland, in contrast to so many of the other colonizing engagements and the forced conversions of people that go, whether than active military accompanied by military forces like we see in Africa or in other parts of the or in South America, other parts of the world. The evangelism of Ireland was entirely non-violent, almost non-violent. Obviously, when you get people together, there's going to be violence and competition. But the coming of Christ came without the force of the military. It came with Patrick's voice as an outsider, a former slave returning to those who enslaved him. Non-imposed. It was a charismatic kind of expression of God's favor, God's power, God's influence, the work of the Spirit. So imposing then violence on this, putting Christianity against new Christians, was introducing a character of the Christian faith which Patrick saw as anathema. So Patrick anathematized Caroticus. He excommunicated him. He said, you are no longer a Christian until you repent of this evil. The king, we don't know what happened. Patrick excommunicates him until the king submits, releases the captives. Caroticus was certainly part of the parish of another Christian leader, so you can see how the politics and all the rest get involved. Patrick didn't himself probably have the absolute authority, according to the political hierarchy of the church, to excommunicate someone, but Patrick didn't care. He says, I proclaim myself a bishop. I proclaim myself part of the Christian faith, and I am calling you out. He didn't see the politics or the hierarchy as a limitation or a barrier. He saw the message of the gospel, and through the courage and perseverance and the endurance that he had gone through throughout his whole life to bring the gospel to people who were constantly trying to kill him or assault him or diminish him, he had no qualms about calling out someone within the church who was doing evil. Patrick saw his authority as from God, not limited to geography, it was limited to the pursuit of righteousness. The Patrick we see here is strong and confident leader, bold, clear, but sees his confidence not as being within his own personality, but coming from his calling in God. He had so committed to his calling of God, he could be humble, as we see in the confession, saying this is what God has done for someone who is undeserving. But we can see this same commitment to God's mission, giving him a boldness and confidence, reminding me of David's boldness before Goliath. At this point in the ministry, he had so much experiences of risking life. He had seen God's faithfulness, but part of seeing that faithfulness is a responsibility. You can't just be silent in the face of evil, especially when that evil is being done by others who are representing the work of Christ. as Herodotus, as a proclaimed Christian, was doing. So what do we do with Patrick? There's so much more I can say, but read him himself. Let's discuss this farther on. If his writings don't reflect the total optimism of Pelagius in saying we can work our way forward, neither do they at all reflect the harsher views of Augustine, and certainly don't reflect the increasingly rigid ecclesiology of Rome. He saw the gospel and the mission as its own drive and its own justification. In his understanding of government mission, it seems that Patrick was vitally influenced by the writings and teachings of John Cassian, who, at least indirectly, but maybe more. The zeal itself betrays the fact that he most likely did not hold to a pure Augustinian understanding of predestination. He saw it important to go to people and share the gospel, not just assume that God was going to pick and choose according to his own will. He saw the need for people to respond. He saw the need to do works of power, but also works of encouragement to lead people into an understanding that brought them into salvation, but also led them towards a kind of empowerment in their Christian life, a growth of maturity. He likely held strongly to the idea that it was essential to be people told about Christ in order to make a decision for Christ. Now, we don't want to turn him into a 20th century evangelist with, all the trappings that come with that. There was probably a different kind of blending here of understanding God's will and work and activity that doesn't quite fit in our categories, but it certainly doesn't fit into the more rigid categories of either Pelagius or Augustine. Patrick probably would not have cared what a council or other ecclesiastical authority taught for its own sake, partly because his own Christianity, while birthed in his family in a more official context of the church and the hierarchy, blossomed in the context of his own calling as a slave by himself, where prayers came. He had a very contemplative, personal connection with God, where he really found this new life and mission that wasn't individualistic. So I'm careful about saying individualistic. Whenever he created and followed, he created these communities. He saw the importance of the church, but he didn't see the church as something that people had to serve. He saw the church as something that served the people, that became this place of renewal. Only as far as he felt it confirmed his own mission, that the authority, ecclesiastical rule, he felt so secure in his mission, and we can say, was he right? Well, look at the impact. The mission he felt called by God to preach, a mission of salvation, a mission of holiness. These aren't separate topics. These are part and parcel of a shared journey of the work of the Spirit.